So today, Fayad joins me, who's currently over in Saudi Arabia, and we're going to be dropping all of the latest things from Saudi, the history, and what to expect in the future. Fayad, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much for coming on. Of course, I'm a long-time follower, and that's why I've reached out. So it's a pleasure for you to be here. So could you start us off then with talking about Saudi football and the history of the game before all the money came in that we know about now?
Yeah, so funnily enough, I actually started watching. I used to live in Dubai, and I started watching the Saudi League after because I believe so much in supporting your local club. So even though I'm Lebanese, but I lived in Dubai all my life, I went and watched my local club there. When you watch the UAE League, it's very much linked to the Saudi League, and that's when I was like, yeah, my dad used to go work in Saudi a lot. He used to tell me, like, if you're watching the UAE League games, you have to watch the Saudi League. This was around 2013. I'd say the biggest players that were coming to Saudi at that time would be someone like Georges Samaras. That was maybe the most high-profile player that you had, or Thiago Neves, ex-Fluminense player. And so the Saudi League has always been one of the, if not the biggest league in the Middle East, even before the money, the most watched league in the Middle East, even before the money. That's if you don't consider Egypt and Morocco from North Africa. And the league has always been pretty interesting. It started with foreign players coming in after the 1978 World Cup. There were a few Saudi representatives and princes that went to the World Cup in Argentina. They were really impressed by the Tunisian national team, so brought those players. But the most high-profile player was Roberto Rivellino, who I just actually made a video on that when Al Hilal and Fluminense played against each other, because he played for both clubs and he actually came to Al Hilal from Fluminense. And so that started years of Saudi trying to bring the biggest players from around the world. They even brought in Hristo Stoichkov for Al Nassr when they were participating in the Club World Cup for a couple of games. And then since then, they'd always focus on bringing good Brazilian players, not ones that were international, but anyone that they could get their hands on that was pretty decent. And then with the 2010s coming in, with every season you'd see more high profile and more high profile and more high profile players coming. And then the 2022 World Cup happened, which is actually, I'm wearing the Saudi Argentina shirt here.
I like that shirt.
Yeah, it's a beautiful shirt.
Yeah.
That game showed the Saudi leaders, everyone in football in Saudi, that okay, football, like, we love it. We've always invested in it. We always had big clubs. Al Hilal and Al Nassr, Al Ahly, Al Ittihad have always been in Champions League finals, and Al Hilal have the most Champions League titles in Asia. But they were like, yeah, this is a chance for us to actually go harder. We've seen China do it, but not really succeed with that. So what if we try doing that? And the first thing was Ronaldo to be the face of the project, and then actually strengthen the teams, privatize clubs, which is actually in the process of happening right now, strengthening the league as a whole and not just the big four clubs, so that you can have a stronger league a la the Brazilian league, which has about, as we've seen at the Club World Cup, 4 big teams just there, and they've still got around 8 to 10 more teams that can actually challenge for the title back home. So ever since then, Saudi's been going through an interesting journey. So the first season, 2023, 2024, the big players came. 2024, 25, there were still a few big players that came, but also just slowly, trying not to capture all that money that they spent, because learning from China's mistakes, it's not just about buying the big players and that's it. Buying big players is a tool to grow the league, whether that's improving psychology of players, whether that's the effect of, like, Cristiano Ronaldo being around the training grounds and how he's inspired young kids all across the country, even young Al Hilal fans, to actually take up football as a full-time thing, and then actually getting teams to make money on their own and not just rely on investment or selling players, and of course increasing attendance, which is, I think, something we'll talk about, because culture of watching football in the Middle East, it's so from England, I know, because I have a lot of friends from England, and English football, all the way down to League Two. Even League Two challenges the Saudi League in terms of attendance. But if you compare the TV figures of Saudi football to the attendance, you'll realize a lot of Saudis do love football, but the culture of attending games is the issue. It was actually an issue in Brazil around 20 years ago. Brazil, one of the most passionate nations in football. Fans love watching, but they'd rather watch in bars than go to stadiums. So that's really been the history of Saudi football recently. And now, there's been big signings that have been happening this week. Al Hilal just signed Theo Hernandez. Al Nassr just signed Jorge Jesus as their manager. And so I think it's going to be a pretty interesting season this year.
So we're going to obviously speak, you've just spoken about the history there, and I suppose we're going to jump ahead just a tiny bit. So when these players first were coming through the door, obviously Ronaldo was the big one. Now, obviously, it's a bit hard to say, but without Ronaldo, would the project have ever been as successful?
So, of course, and you can look at the way that they tried to extend this contract this year. One of the main things was, it's not just about what Ronaldo provides on the pitch, but as a brand, it's important for Ronaldo to be there. And I'm 100% sure had Ronaldo left, they would have tried their best to sign Messi, right? Because The reality is, yes, the Benzemas are great. Yes, the Milinkovic-Savic are great. Yes, the Aubameyangs are great. But Ronaldo really is somebody that you can walk to anyone on the street and be like, do you know Cristiano Ronaldo? Well, he's playing in Saudi. Aubameyang, yes, of course, Premier League fans will know him. Of course, French League fans will know him. Of course, global football fans will know him. But he's not a name that Ronaldo is. Ronaldo breaks through households. Like people who've never watched football in Saudi Arabia before have gone to Al Nassr games now. That's the power of Ronaldo. But nobody who doesn't watch football is going to go and watch for an Aubameyang or a Milinkovic-Savic, with all due respect to those players.
Obviously, China and Saudi Arabia, they all compete in the Asian Champions League. And obviously, it's quite important for Asian clubs. It's very important. But there's always been that question of, will Saudi Arabia join the UEFA Champions League, which I think is a bit disrespectful. But if we're looking at the Asian Champions League, away from Saudi Arabia, what clubs should we be looking out for?
So when it comes to the Asian Champions League, of course, you've still got clubs from the UAE and Qatar who do pretty well, and especially Japan and Korea. But the problem with Japan and Korea is they've got strong national teams, and they've got a lot of players playing in the Premier League and all around Europe who are better than the Saudi national team players. And that's the difference that comes in. So Japanese league is very competitive like the Brazilian league, but they don't have the super teams. So the Saudi league is sort of like the La Liga of Asia. You've got Real Madrid and Barcelona, right? Maybe the rest of La Liga can't compete with the rest of the Premier League, right? Maybe as an overall league or even the Bundesliga. But the top two clubs in La Liga will almost always make it to the semis and final of the Champions League. So that's where Saudi tops those clubs. But I mean, when it comes to Japan and Korea, I mean, we did see Urawa at the Club World Cup and also Ulsan, but they haven't been doing too well in recent years. And I mean, to give you an example of how competitive it is in Japan, Urawa, who've played at the Club World Cup, have 3 Asian Champions League titles to their name, but only 1 J League title. It's very rare to have more Champions League titles than domestic league titles. So I'd say those are the clubs that to look out for. But to be very honest with you, I think in the next 5 years, unless there is more investment coming in, and we're seeing in Japan all their good young players are actually being taken away from Europe at a young age, I don't think anybody's going to be competing with Saudi. I think the exponential growth in Saudi is going to make the gap too big in Asia.
Obviously, Saudi Arabia are going to be hosting Club World Cups, but obviously the Club World Cup that is still going on. I'm talking from an English perspective here, so I don't quite know what it's like in Saudi. Well, obviously, we can watch it on DAZN, and that's been a free viewing, which has obviously been good for Saudi football and overall.
Yeah.
But in terms of like the Al Nassr versus Al Hilal in the Saudi Pro League, how can they adapt it to make English people, to make Europeans, to make people around the world want to watch it from their house?
Yeah, so of course having TV rights accessible, which I think for those big games they've done a lot over the last 2 years, but really it's just having those players, and then that's the initial way to bring them in, and then when people watch the games realize, damn, well the fans are interesting, the games are actually, we've had lots of 3-3s, 3-2s, 4-1s, like high scoring big games. If all these big games ended 0-0, I don't think anyone would watch them. Like Al Ittihad and Al Nassr, Al Ittihad, I think they went 2-0 up, came back 2-2, and then scored the 90th minute winner. You had Al Nassr beat Al Hilal 3-1. You had Al Ahli go 1-0 up against Al Hilal, then lose 2-1, and then you had Ivan Toney score a hat trick at Al Hilal. So those games were all high scoring games, and I think that's the best way. But now it's all about making sure that that's consistent and gradual. And the fact that they have 4 big teams means they have around 8 to 12 games a season where people will be able to watch them. You need a bit more, because out of say 150 plus games a season, 12 is not enough. And again, I don't think anyone's going to be tuning into mid-table or lower table Saudi games just yet. Like right now in the Premier League, fans from all over the world, they'd still watch Crystal Palace and Brentford. That's why the Premier League is a global phenomenon. La Liga, it's still Real Madrid against Alaves, might watch it, but Alaves against Elche, probably not. That's where the Premier League stands out, and I think that's what the Saudi League is ultimately trying to reach. But that's a whole 10 to 15-year process. We saw the Premier League back in 92. It was just the big clubs, but now it is a league on its own. Now it's just a Premier League game is a Premier League game, and that's it.
So obviously Steven Gerrard went to El Attifaq, and there's obviously quite a lot of clubs in that division that we haven't quite heard about too well in England. Obviously Gerrard going there brought attention to it. How do they bridge the gap then between these lower league sides? Because I heard one time that the investment is obviously nowhere near as big as Al Hilal and Al Nassr.
Yeah, so it's not as big, but what they're trying to do now is actually privatize those mid-table and lower table clubs. There's actually a process right now where 6 to 8 clubs, off the top of my head, are in that privatization process. So previously it would be government owned, or people, or maybe a prince that would be owning it. But right now they're trying to make it like we want these clubs to be self-sufficient on their own. Now, that is going to create a big gap. That is the issue. In the process of doing that, we might see the top eight, because you've got Neom right now that have gone up, and then you've got Al Diriyah coming in next season. They've got big investment behind them. Neom have just signed Lacazette and got Christopher Galtier as their coach. So you're going to see clubs like that, but then you're going to see clubs with not too much investment probably lose 8-0, 9-0, and we have seen those scores over the last season. But that's just a natural part of the process as they sort of balance out the league in the coming years.
Obviously, Ronaldo, as much as we might think it, he can't play football forever.
Yeah.
And obviously, the second division in Saudi, which you just reminded me about, obviously, Saudi Arabia has just more than the Saudi Pro League. So,
Yeah.
could you talk to us about how the attention could go down to these lower sides, and how many leagues are there in Saudi?
So the Saudi Football League system is 5 divisions. You've got the first one with 18 teams, the second one with around 20 teams, and they've just implemented the whole championship playoff idea where third to sixth play in a playoff. Then you've got the third division split into 2 groups, the second division split into 2 groups. The third division split into 4 groups, and then the fourth division is usually on and off, but more like regional leagues. Now, the reality is what they're trying to do is clubs that have or look good on a business point, from a business point of view, whether that means they have big fans or big investors, or it's going to become a touristic city in the future, they want those clubs in the Premier League as soon as possible. That's why we've seen Neom. They've qualified to they got promoted to the Saudi Pro League last season with relative ease. But I think we're not going to be paying attention to those leagues in the coming years for anything other than business investments, but not in terms of results at all. But I think they'll become a hub for those Saudi players that, okay, we can't find the club in the Pro League because they're signing the world's best players and we need more game time, so we'll go down a division.
I suppose in Saudi Arabia as well, the players that are going to, like, from the Premier League to the Championship to over in Saudi, like Jordan Henderson, for example, they're all getting huge wages. Not only that, it's accompanied by quite a lot, because I know Saudi Arabia have been very, very accommodative towards these footballers. But what are the facilities like overall? Because who was it? Was it Jordan Henderson or someone returned to their national team camp and they weren't fit?
Yeah. So, yes, facilities is a big thing. And this even goes back to the whole idea of attendance. So, the thing we mentioned with signing big players is a tool. What needs to also happen is the facilities being improved. I remember Al Hilal fans, when Inzaghi signed and he came in and saw the club facilities, some Al Hilal fans were like, why'd we show him these facilities? I mean, like, we're a big club and everything, but we really need the behind the scenes to be great. And maybe it's not so much about the match fit, but obviously the quality of these facilities is not going to be on Premier League level. And I think that's always been the issue with Middle Eastern football. We kind of have this stereotype where we love spending big on players, spending things on the things that people can see. But I've always mentioned, and I've written articles from 2014, 2015, need to focus on grassroots, need to focus on facilities, need to focus even on small things like the media zone, right? Is the media zone accessible for journalists from around the world? Is it easy for them to get through, or is it hard? All of these small things is ultimately what's going to make Saudi football successful, not just the players on the pitch. Because if the players, okay, they're enjoying their games, but they're not enjoying their life, or they're not enjoying the training process, or journalists are finding it hard to get to, or even fans from around the world, like even something that has nothing to do with football, but flights, right? Let's say fans want to watch these big games, but there's no direct flights from a certain country, right? This is a non-football factor that could affect the success of the Saudi Pro League. And that's why obviously we're seeing that even on a national level, getting something like Riyadh Air to be active in the next few years is something that's going to benefit the Saudi League, with more destinations coming directly to Saudi.
Obviously, the World Cup is going to be hosted in Saudi Arabia, which is, again, with the flight situation, with all these things taken into account, could that World Cup be a big statement? Because obviously the stadiums are so big, and just Saudi Arabia in general is a place that perhaps it could be a first-time visit for a lot of people.
Yeah. So I think for sure Saudi. So again, I work with a lot of this stuff like the Asian Cup that's happening, and there's obviously the Expo coming in 2030. So Saudi is trying to use these events and sort of build itself into a global sporting hub by bringing in fans for a test run. Like, you've got the Esports World Cup right now. By bringing in people from, let's say, Morocco, China, Brazil, Russia, those people can come even as players or as managers or as officials, see Saudi, go like, hey, we actually had a good time in Saudi, tell other people about it, and they come for test runs before that. But yes, it still will be the first time for a lot of people in 2034, and it's a big challenge because, again, it's not just about, like, Saudi hosting the World Cup is not just about football. It's about how can we get the whole national vision to come together to create a logistically great and footballingly great World Cup.
I believe they've already announced a lot of the stadiums for that World Cup, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of them are in Riyadh, but the ones that aren't perhaps in the centre of Saudi Arabia, what's the travelling like for all these fans?
So currently, you can go from Riyadh to the eastern province, where a few stadiums will be by train or by bus, and even by plane, 30-minute plane flight. To Jeddah, you can go on a 2-hour flight, which is there's like 60 to 70 flights a day, very easy to do. But they're also going to create a high-speed railway. But then you've got places like Neom and Abha, which right now Neom doesn't have a direct access for just normal people to go. They do have an airport, but it's mainly for workers. And Abha is all the way down in the south near the border with Yemen, and that's a 10-hour drive. There are flights there, of course, and it's a beautiful place with lots of nature. But I think it's going to be targeted maybe more to countries from Africa, countries from different parts of Asia that are going to be there. They have more easy access to there. But of course, one of my favorite forms of traveling in Saudi is road trips. 3-hour road trips is very normal, and I'm actually doing a road trip to Jeddah next week, a 9-hour drive. It's going to be my first time. So yeah, I think there's many different ways, and they are going to make even more ways to get to these different cities by 2034.
In 2000, Al Nassr were the first Saudi team in the Club World Cup. Fast forward 25 years, and we've seen quite a lot of Saudi clubs and other competing clubs, like the one from Japan that you mentioned, that perhaps us Europeans don't have too much of an idea about them. What has the Club World Cup been like for you to experience? Obviously, you watch these guys every week, but have you been there thinking, I've told you all that these players are this good, and now you're going to see it?
Yeah, well, of course, I really enjoyed the Club World Cup. There's been a lot of criticism towards it, and I do agree. There are aspects of the Club World Cup in itself that I think maybe not good enough for players, not good for fans, and maybe at a time of the season where people don't care that much and people are kind of burnt out. Like even fans get burnt out from watching too many games. But in terms of a footballing perspective, like getting to see Al Hilal play Pachuca and play Real Madrid and play Man City and play Fluminense, these are games you don't usually get maybe once in a lifetime. The only time Al Hilal and Real Madrid ever played was in that final of the Club World Cup in 2022. And the only time they played City before that was in a friendly in 2013. So being able to see these games that you don't often get to see is great. And it also gives Al Hilal and any other Asian clubs. I mean, Urawa played a great game against Inter Milan, very unlucky to lose in the last 10 minutes. And even Ulsan played against Fluminense. They lost 3-2. This was a chance for them to show that, we've actually got good quality players, and football isn't just about how much money you have, right? Which is a bit of a funny situation because, of course, with Saudi football, there's been a lot of financial investment. But still, when you look at the value of the top European clubs, compare them to even the best Saudi clubs, it's still a vast difference.
What's it going to take then for Saudi football to be? Because Ronaldo said a few weeks ago he thinks Saudi Arabian football is in the top 5 leagues in the world. How is Saudi Arabia going to attract so many people and so many tourists? Because obviously it's going up every year, but how do you get like a booming place in Asia into a hotspot for Europeans and beyond?
Well, first of all, I think there's two things. Number one, I actually don't believe Saudi is a top 5 league in the world just yet. I think the top 4 clubs can compete with European clubs, if they were to be put in the Champions League, just like I think with Brazilian clubs. But I think as a league in itself, it still needs to grow because a strength of a league is not in the strength of its top teams. La Liga does have Real Madrid and Barcelona, but they don't represent the whole of La Liga. It's the 20 teams that do. And then the second truth that we have to admit is that something like this, we will only, I don't think many people mention it, we'll only ever see the true strength of the Saudi league as a top 5 way after Ronaldo retires. It could be a few years, could be 10 years, because to strengthen a whole league, it's a process. Privatization doesn't happen in 6 months and there you go, you're a successful money-making club, right? Attendance has never grown by 100% in any league in the world in just one season and consistently done so, right? So it's really about building a culture, building a behind the scenes, building a facilities that are great, building transport. And for that all to happen, I think it needs about 10 years. But of course, we have Vision 2030, we've got World Cup 2034, and we've got a lot more things coming to Saudi Arabia. I think it will succeed, but I think naturally 3 years in, people will be like, yeah, I think Saudi's not doing well anymore because the growth isn't as big as signing Ronaldo, signing Benzema, signing Milinkovic-Savic, signing Ruben Neves, and so on and so forth.
Tyson Fury was there boxing in Riyadh not too long ago. Other sports, could you just give us an idea about the other sports and have they got as much investment perhaps as football?
Yes, so actually, you've got the World Pool Championship and the Saudi Arabia Snooker Masters coming up next month. Snooker Masters has already been one of the highest winning, if not the highest prize money in snooker, and one of the top 4 championships right now. World Pool Championship coming for the second year in a row. You had the World Combat Games revive after 10 years of not being there, in 2023 to Saudi. Of course, golf, a big one. Boxing, massive. WWE just completed their Night of Champions with John Cena and CM Punk here in Saudi. So yes, there is investment going into lots of different sports, because one of the main Saudi vision goals is to have 80% of the population practice sport 3 to 4 times a week, almost on a daily basis too. So again, it's a national sporting vision, and football is just the beacon, the thing that leads all of it.
The big money, Jordan Henderson, all these big players are going there. And I keep mentioning Henderson, but also you've got Fabinho, Benzema.
Yeah.
When will the big money stop for these guys? Or will Saudi just keep pumping money towards players and tripling their wages from the Premier League?
I don't think. I think even Saudi knows it's not sustainable. It's a way in, but it's not a way that you can continue to do unless you're getting a return on investment. And again, if you're paying above market wages for the wages and even for the transfer fees, it is a bit hard to see that be sustainable. And that's why it's important that attendance grows. That's why it's important that TV rights and sponsorships increase. And so if you got now 10 million people watching Al Hilal against Al Nasser as opposed to 2 million before, that's 8 million more eyes, can get more sponsors, etc., etc. I think that there's going to be a time where this does stop. Doesn't mean that it stops for the big players, right? I think there'll still be a lot of movement towards Saudi, but we'll see maybe more second tier players rather than the big ones. So, like, I'll give you an example of that is Theo Hernandez. I mean, he's a good player, but he's not Ronaldo level or Benzema level. But he is a player that is definitely going to strengthen the Saudi league and would get into a lot of teams in Europe. And so those are the type of players that I think Saudi will be looking at in the next few years.
Your content creation, I wanted to just touch upon that because obviously you do your TikToks, you do it in a variety of language, by the way, which is great. What was there a reason behind you wanting to start your content creation journey, and was it because of Saudi football?
So I actually started way back in 2013 covering Saudi football in English. I opened the first ever Middle Eastern website with my co-founder Wael Jaber, who actually works with the Saudi League now, so it's come full circle. We used to cover Saudi football and Middle Eastern football in general in English. I had my Twitter account, but then I moved to Australia to study, and watching football from there was very hard, so I just watched football and didn't create any content. I moved to Saudi in 2023 as I got a job here, and that's when at the same time it coincided with Ronaldo arriving and the whole league growing, and I just saw a lot of misinformation. And I don't disagree with criticism, I disagree with misinformation. And I thought, there's not many English content creators on the Saudi league, and there's not many English content creators on the Saudi league who have actually watched it from a long time and actually know the history, read books. I have books from the 70s that I buy from like small shops here about Saudi football. And I thought, I mean, the least I could do for a place that has always given me a lot and a culture that I've connected with a lot is to actually use my English language and even Spanish and Portuguese to ensure that people from around the world can learn new things about it that they didn't know before. That's the least I could do. And I've always loved being a content creator, and I've always loved telling stories. And so, yeah, I've been pretty much enjoying it.
And when the Club World Cup comes to Saudi Arabia and the World Cup itself, obviously the World Cup is it first, right?
So the World Cup's in 2034. The last I heard was that Saudi and Brazil wanted to host the 2029 Club World Cup, but I haven't really. I've been just out of service this week, so I didn't see if there was any confirmation. Have they confirmed the next Club World Cup host?
I don't think they have.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah,
Not from
but
what I've seen.
but I think for sure, if not the 2033 one, Saudi is going to be one of the hosts. Saudi and Brazil and even the US again, I think those countries are going to want to host the Club World Cup. But you've got the Asian Cup, the first ever Asian Cup in Saudi Arabia happening in 2027. That's about a year and a half from now. So that's going to be sort of a preview to the World Cup with some of the stadiums, with fans coming in from all over the continent. So we'll see how that goes too.
I mean, to host anything from Saudi Arabia to America to Brazil is quite unsustainable for fans. Do you not think?
It is. Look, I agree that Europe, the reality of Europe, especially with the interconnectivity between all the nations and the ease of travel, right? It is the best place in the world to host things like the Olympics and the World Cup. It's the best region, right? The US, you've got 6 hours between LA and New York, right? But you can go from Lisbon to London way less, right? Brazil at the same time. In fact, Brazil, one of the reasons that the Brazilian league wasn't an actual national league until like the 80s was because you couldn't travel from different places. And Saudi Arabia, the same. There's a lot of regional areas where it's much harder to travel to and from. So yes, for fans, it's much more unsustainable. But in the end, I mean, it's also unfair to have every World Cup in Europe, even though, like, as an experience for a fan, if you ask me, yes, a World Cup in Europe or an Olympics in Europe would be so easy. You go from France to England to Germany to Switzerland with relative ease. But I think that's the challenge, right? We've seen that challenge in the US, and I've had friends who went to the Club World Cup in the US, and they said just the traveling, like, I've traveled longer flights in a few days than I've had in the whole of last year, right? Which is a lot. I mean, 6 hours to go within the same country. I mean, when I was living back in Australia, to do a 6 hour flight, it's a once a year thing if you have business, right? But in America, it's a common thing. How many people go from New York to LA almost every single day? They're two of the biggest hubs, right? So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how sustainable that is. But also by 2034, will we have new, higher forms of transport? Are we going to get bullet trains? Are we going to get flying hoverboards? I don't know, but definitely they're going to be thinking about improving that. Yeah.
And what about your content? I mean, are you going to be going to the World Cup in Saudi, obviously, because you live there?
Yeah, so I mean, look, again, 10 years ago, I just started covering Saudi football, and I was watching Georgios Samaras play for Al Hilal, and never thought in a million years that Ronaldo would come. Maybe the biggest signings we'd had since then were Sully Montari coming to Al Ittihad, maybe Ioannis Fetfatsidis when he was, in Europe, and he came to Al Ahly. And so we never thought that would manifest into something as big as this. Then you had players like Luis Gustavo coming to Al Nassr, and then you had Giovinco and Luciano Vietto and Bafetibi Gomes coming to Al Hilal. And you thought, okay, those are some decent players. But even then, you didn't think Ronaldo would be coming to Saudi. So 10 years from now, I mean, of course, with the information I have, I would love to be there, but I'll be 35 years old by then. So I'm not really sure if that'll come true. But of course, I aim to be there.
Absolutely. With Qatar, obviously in the World Cup, and it's a bit unfair to I don't know, to compare America and I don't know, Germany, for example. But obviously they're quite close to each other, Saudi and Qatar. What's the similarities and what will be the differences moving into the future with the sporting events?
Yeah, well, I think that, look, in terms of cultures and in terms of lifestyle, Saudi and Qatar are very similar. But Qatar is, maybe, I can't tell you this in terms of real statistics, but just from a bird's eye point of view, Qatar is maybe not that much bigger than the city I live in, Riyadh, right? So Qatar compared to Saudi, they say it's just a neighborhood in Saudi. So in Qatar, we were able to go to all 8 stadiums within 2 days. That's not going to be possible in Saudi, just like America. So there are a lot of similarities, but there's also huge differences. The population is bigger. The foreign population versus local population is different in Qatar as opposed to Saudi Arabia. Excuse me. And at the same time, the difference between Riyadh and Jeddah, which is around 900 kilometers away from each other, they're two completely different cities, different types of people, even though they're all Saudi, but different types of people, different personalities. One's on the beach, one's in the middle of the desert. So it is going to be completely different, I think, to Qatar. And I think once people see a second World Cup in the Middle East, that's when they realize, okay, the World Cup in Qatar and Saudi, these World Cups are actually not as similar as you'd think they would be. Same thing, I'd say it's like Spain and Portugal, right? They border each other, but the difference in size, the difference in people, the difference even in language, even if they understand each other, there's actually a bigger difference than you'd think when it comes to Spain and Portugal. Yeah.
Some of the best players that I've seen play football have been Ivan Toney. Firmino has got a love. I've got a love for him for sure. What's it been like for these players to go to Saudi? Because Ivan Toney, for example, he's come back to England camp and he's been exceptional.
So, yes, some players have done absolutely fantastic. I mean, we saw Milinkovic-Savic. It's like he hasn't lost a step. But again, and even N'Golo Kante at the last year's Euros. But yeah, it's very hard to compare players, right? Because you could look at one player and say, well, he flopped at the Euros or he flopped at the Club World Cup. And you look at another player and you go like, well, he's too good. I just think the reality is it's very hard to just judge a player and be like, yeah, this player, because some people were saying Ivan Toney scored most of his goals from penalties in Saudi and he was not too good in his first 6 months here, right? But he's improved a lot in the second half of the season. And so people started saying, oh, the Saudi League isn't that easy. He scored more goals in the Premier League than he did in the Saudi League. But I don't even think that's a fair comparison. I just think the reality is every league is different. Every game is different. Every team you play for is different. Every coach you play for is different. Some players have a professional mindset that no matter where they're playing, they're going to give their 150%. And some players, if I'm playing in the Premier League, I will. But if I'm playing in another league, I might not. Like we just saw with John Duran, he's gone on loan to Fenerbahce. I like he's a player who's shown that he's very talented, but maybe his mindset is and maybe that's one of the reasons that Aston Villa said it's worth selling him now, getting a big buck, and then letting him go because he might not have that, he might not reach his ceiling with us because of his mentality. So I don't think it's really a case of can the players perform or how has it been for them. I think each player is an individual thing. It's a case by case basis.
Last thing from me would be: do you think the Premier League and Saudi football could ever compete with each other?
I think just like when I said Saudi League is going to be ahead of the rest of Asia unless there's some big money investment that keeps the level of competition towards each other. I think the Premier League is already way too sustainable to be caught by any league in the world, let alone Saudi League, right? The money that's coming in, the exposure, and then there's also the fact of changing mindsets. So obviously, back in the day when the Brazilian league was at its peak with Pelé, right? To change people's mindsets was much easier because there wasn't social media to tell you. So when football first came on the TV screens, all right, we don't have a bias. We just maybe heard about the Brazilian league, maybe heard about the Italian league. But right now, anybody who comes into football, it's Premier League. And the basis of football is the Premier League. Everything you build back on is the Premier League. So even if you like look at America, right? You've got Premier League clubs with big fan bases there, like they've got a whole ultras or a fan group there. Meanwhile, Al Hilal, well, even like with PSG, for example, you saw a lot of fans with the Georgia flag for Kvaratskhelia, right? So you might get fans supporting for their national team players, but they don't have that reach of the Premier League. Premier League is one of those leagues in the world where in Australia at 4 a.m. there'll be fan groups coming together to watch. Like I'm a Liverpool fan, so we used to
Same
have
here.
games up at Well, congrats on the league this season, right?
Absolutely.
So we used to go to bars at 4 a.m. in the absolute freezing cold. Like I remember watching the Champions League final against Spurs, absolutely freezing cold at 4:30 in the morning. We'd watch that. Not gonna get that for almost any other league in the world, right? So that's why I don't think. I think we'll have some interesting games, and I think there'll be lots of media battles. But I don't think the league as a whole will compete just yet. But 20 years from now, we'll see.
Fayad, thank you very, very much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I was really happy to speak to you. It's been a great pleasure.